I remember the day I arrived in Dust Valley like it was carved into my bones. The wind was sharp, dry enough to steal the breath right out of your chest, and the sun hung over the land like a watchful eye that never blinked. I had one small trunk, a torn bonnet, and the foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, this place would let me start over. The stagecoach dropped me near the old saloon, its wooden sign creaking like an old soul too tired to complain. People stopped what they were doing the moment I stepped down. Their eyes crawled over me, weighing every pound of my body, every wrinkle in my dress, every whisper they thought they'd heard about the woman from Kansas who'd left her husband's grave behind. I didn't meet their stares. I just lifted my chin and kept walking, dust curling around my boots like smoke. I'd promised myself no more tears, not where anyone could see. The boarding house stood at the edge of town, its paint peeling and its porch leaning like an old man after too much whiskey. Mrs. Green, the keeper, eyed me from behind her spectacles when I asked about a room. "Got one upstairs," she said, "but folks here talk. You best be ready for that." "I've lived through worse than words," I told her. She looked at me for a long moment, then handed me a key. That night I couldn't sleep. Through the thin walls I heard laughter from the saloon, the jingle of spurs, and the lonely cry of a coyote somewhere beyond the ridge. I lay there thinking about the letter that had brought me here, an offer of work on a ranch outside town. Cook needed, honest hands preferred, hard work guaranteed. Signed, Elias Stoneheart. I didn't know then that the man behind that name would change everything. The next morning, I saddled up the borrowed mare Mrs. Green let me use and headed toward the hills. The trail was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the land itself was listening. After an hour, I saw it. A wide stretch of fields, a corral full of restless horses, and a tall figure standing by the gate, hat pulled low, arms crossed. "Miss Caldwell?" he asked when I stopped in front of him. His voice was deep, steady, like the earth speaking. "Not Caldwell," I said softly. "My name's Clara Vance." He studied me for a long time, then nodded once. "You can start with breakfast. The men eat at dawn. And don't burn the biscuits." I wanted to tell him I'd cooked through droughts, deaths, and wars, but I just nodded. He turned and walked away without another word, his boots leaving deep marks in the dust. And as I stood there, staring after him, the wind tugged at my shawl, whispering secrets I wasn't ready to hear yet. Dust Valley didn't feel like home. Not yet. But for the first time in years, I felt like I'd come to the right place. The days at the Stoneheart Ranch began before the sun dared to rise. The air was sharp, the kind that bit at your throat, and the world was still painted in gray. I'd light the stove before the roosters even remembered to crow, wrapping my shawl tight while the fire licked at the cold. The kitchen became my battlefield. Flour, iron pans, steam, and silence. The ranch hands would drift in half awake, scraping chairs and muttering half-words, their boots heavy with the dust of yesterday. None of them spoke much to me at first. Maybe they didn't know what to say to a woman like me. Too quiet, too round, too unfamiliar. But I could feel their eyes when I turned my back. Curiosity mixed with judgment. Men on the frontier didn't see many women, and when they did, she was supposed to be either fragile or wild. I was neither. I was simply here. Elias Stoneheart came in last. Always. He'd stand by the doorway, hat shadowing his eyes, watching the morning unfold. He never rushed, never barked orders. His presence alone set the rhythm of the place. "Biscuits are better today," he said one morning. "Just that." "Practice," I replied. He nodded once, took his coffee, and left. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Those 3 words, "biscuits are better today," sat with me all day like a secret blessing. By the 3rd week, I'd learned the rhythm of the ranch, the creak of the windmill, the whistle of the kettle when the boys came back from the pastures, the way the land looked when the sun sank behind the ridge. Not golden, but soft, forgiving. Still, there were moments when the loneliness clawed at me. In the evenings, I'd sit by the window sewing or pretending to. From there, I could see Elias out by the barn, lantern in hand, checking the horses even when everyone else was asleep. He didn't know I watched him, or maybe he did. One night, a storm rolled in from the west, the kind that turns the sky to iron and the air to breathless fear. The wind hit the house like fists, and the rain came in sideways. I ran outside before I could think. The barn door was swinging open, banging hard against the wall. "Elias!" I shouted into the roar, my skirt tangled around my legs, my boots sinking into the mud. He was already there, fighting with the latch, his coat soaked through. Lightning cracked across the sky, and for one brief, white second, I saw his face. Not stern, not silent, but raw. Human. "Get back inside!" he yelled, his voice lost to the wind. "I'm not leaving till this door's shut." Together we forced it closed, the wood slamming with a final, deafening thud. We stood there, gasping, drenched, the storm screaming just outside the walls. I looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't a giant carved from stone like I'd thought. He was just a man holding too much silence inside him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he took off his hat and brushed the water from his hair. "You could have been hurt," he said. "So could you." A ghost of a smile flickered across his face, gone almost before it began. "You're stubborn. I've been called worse." We stayed there until the thunder softened and the rain slowed to a whisper. When we finally walked back to the house, he held the lantern low so I wouldn't slip. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't have to. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire, my dress still damp, the storm's echo still in my bones. The ranch felt different now, as if some invisible wall had shifted just a little. For the first time, I wasn't just a cook. I was part of something, fragile, quiet, but real. And in the faint light of the dying fire, I caught myself smiling. Not because Elias Stoneheart had spoken more than usual, but because, for the first time in years, someone had seen me. Not for what I looked like, not for what I'd lost, but for standing my ground in the rain. Took days for the earth to dry after the storm. The ground steamed under the sun, and the air smelled of wet wood and horses. Life slowly crept back to its rhythm. Boots in the dirt, hammers against fences, and the low, lazy hum of wind through the valley. But something in that rhythm had changed. The men no longer looked at me as if I didn't belong. They still didn't talk much. Ranch hands rarely do. But they started leaving empty coffee cups by the sink instead of the table, knowing I'd collect them. One even tipped his hat one morning. That small gesture felt heavier than any word. Elias had changed too, though he wouldn't admit it. He still moved through the ranch like a man carved from patience and habit, but there was a new softness in his silence. Sometimes, when he came in for breakfast, he'd pause just long enough for our eyes to meet, as if to say something and then think better of it. And though I never said it out loud, I waited for those small moments like the world depended on them. One morning, I was hanging laundry by the creek when I heard the sound. Faint at first, then louder, the desperate bleating of a calf. I dropped the sheet and ran. The rains had swollen the river again, turning the shallow water into a restless brown current. On the far side, tangled in the reeds, a young calf was caught, its small legs struggling against the pull. "Hold on, baby," I whispered, though it couldn't hear me. I looked around for help, but the men were far off in the upper fields, and Elias had gone to the north ridge at dawn. I could see no one. The water was cold when I stepped in, soaking my skirt instantly, the current stronger than it looked. My boots sank into the mud, the pull trying to drag me down. Every step felt like walking against time itself. Halfway across, the river hit my waist, and the sound of rushing water filled my ears. I could barely breathe, but the calf cried again, and that sound kept me moving. When I reached it, I wrapped my arms around its slick, shivering body and pulled with all my weight. "Come on, sweetheart," I gasped. "We're not giving up now." Kicked, panicked, but I held firm. Inch by inch, we moved toward the shore. My legs burned, my arms trembled. I could feel my body fighting itself, but something deeper took over. When we finally stumbled onto dry land, I fell to my knees, the calf collapsing beside me. Mud streaked my dress, my hands, my face. Everything. I laughed, breathless and wild, like someone who just stolen back her own life. Then I heard the sound of hooves. Elias dismounted before his horse even stopped moving. "Clara!" His voice cracked like a whip. "Are you out of your mind?" I tried to stand, but my legs gave way. "He was drowning," I said simply. He stopped a few feet away, his jaw tight, eyes flashing with anger, or something that looked like it but wasn't. "You could have been swept away." "I wasn't. That's not the point." I looked at him then, really looked. The dust on his boots, the lines on his face, the storm still hiding in his eyes. "It is to me," I said quietly. "You save cattle every day, Elias. Today I saved one too." Something in his face changed. His anger softened into silence. That same silence that used to build walls, now breaking them down instead. He took a step closer, then another, until he was close enough for me to see the water drying on his gloves. He hesitated, then reached out and brushed a strand of wet hair from my face. His hand trembled just slightly. "Let's get you warm," he said. Back at the ranch, Mrs. Green scolded me as she helped peel off my soaked clothes. "You'll catch your death, girl," she muttered. But her hands were gentle, her eyes worried in that motherly way that people like me don't often earn. Elias didn't stay inside. I watched him from the window as he tended the rescued calf. His hands steady, voice low and patient. The way he spoke to that little creature. I'd never heard his voice sound that kind before. When he finally came in, his hat dripping, he paused by the door. "You're stubborn," he said again. "Seems that way." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "The men said you fought the river. They're calling you Iron Clara now." I laughed. A real laugh, the kind that shakes dust off old memories. "Iron Clara," I repeated. "That's a first. You earned it." He turned to leave, but before he did, he looked back. "You did good." The words were simple, but they landed deep, like sunlight after too long in the dark. That night, the ranch was quiet except for the slow crackle of the fire. I sat with a blanket around my shoulders, thinking about the river, how it tried to take me, and how, somehow, I didn't let it. Out here, strength wasn't about muscles or size or what people thought you could do. It was about standing up when the current tried to drag you down. And for the first time since I'd come to Dust Valley, I didn't feel like a visitor. I felt like I belonged. Not because anyone told me so, but because I'd earned it inch by muddy inch. Somewhere outside, I heard Elias' boots on the porch, the faint creak of the boards. He didn't knock. He didn't have to. The night was thick with quiet, but it was no longer empty. It was full of something new, something fragile, something real, like the river that had finally learned to rest. The days after the river were strange. Lighter somehow, but sharper, too. Word spread fast on a ranch. By noon the next day, everyone knew that I'd pulled a calf out of the flood. They told the story like I'd fought a monster and won, though I knew it was just a frightened animal and a moment of stubbornness. Still, something changed in the way they looked at me. Men who once passed by in silence now nodded when they saw me. Someone started calling me Iron Clara, and the name stuck like dust on boots. I didn't correct them. There was pride in it and something like belonging. But belonging can be its own kind of storm. Elias was different with me after that day. He didn't talk more, not exactly, but the pauses between his words softened. He'd sometimes linger by the kitchen door, asking about the bread or whether the coffee was strong enough. Simple things, everyday things, but the way he said them made my chest ache. One morning, I caught him watching me fix a tear in the tablecloth. "You always mend what's torn," he said quietly. "Some things are worth saving," I replied. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded and left without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how his voice had changed, lower, gentler, almost hesitant. Scared me, that gentleness. I'd come here to start over, not to feel something that could undo me again. A few nights later, the men built a fire near the corral. A tradition, they said, after every hard week. Mrs. Green brought out stew and cornbread, and for once, I joined them instead of staying behind the kitchen door. The air was cool, the stars sharp and clear. The fire cracked and popped, sending sparks into the dark like fireflies. Someone played a harmonica, and laughter rolled through the night, deep, full, and alive. I sat on a log beside the flames, unsure where to put my hands. Then one of the men, Sam, the youngest, handed me a tin cup of coffee. "You earned a place at the fire, ma'am," he said with a grin. The others nodded in quiet agreement. I smiled shy, uncertain. Didn't know there were rules about fires. "There ain't," another man said. "Just respect." That word, respect, warmed me more than the flames. Elias joined them later, silent as ever, his hat low over his brow. When he sat across the fire from me, the flickering light caught his face. Tired, weathered, but calm. He didn't say a word, just tipped his hat slightly. For a while, I watched the sparks rise and vanish into the night. The music faded, replaced by stories, half true, half invented. Someone asked if I missed the city, the noise, the comfort of being unseen. "I used to," I admitted. "But there's a different kind of quiet here. It listens back." The men laughed softly, not at me but with me. Even Elias looked up, his eyes catching the light. I hadn't realized how much I missed that sound. Laughter that didn't sting, silence that didn't judge. Later, when most had drifted away, I stayed by the dying fire. The stars seemed endless, cold and bright. Elias was still there, sitting across from me, whittling a piece of wood with slow, practiced hands. "Did you ever think you'd end up here?" he asked suddenly. I shook my head. "No, I didn't think I'd end up anywhere, really." He smiled faintly, the firelight tracing the lines on his face. "You belong more than most." I wanted to thank him, to tell him what that meant, but the words stuck in my throat. So I just nodded, and the silence between us filled with the sound of crackling wood and distant coyotes. When he stood to leave, he looked at me once more. "The storm changed more than the land," he said. And before I could ask what he meant, he was gone, his footsteps fading into the night. I stayed by the fire long after, staring into the embers until they glowed like pieces of memory. Maybe he was right. Maybe the storm had changed everything. Not just the land, not just the people, but something in me. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting to be judged or forgiven. I was just here, in the quiet, in the warmth, in the company of those who no longer looked through me but at me. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something that didn't need to be named yet. Something that felt like peace. It started with whispers. They floated across the ranch like dry leaves, weightless, harmless at first. I caught pieces of them while washing dishes, or hanging sheets, or passing through the stables. "She's got away with the boss. Maybe that's how she keeps her job." Pretty bold for a woman built like that. Each word was soft as dust, but together they stung like sand in an open wound. I thought I'd learned how to ignore that sound. Judgment dressed as curiosity. But the thing about starting over is that you always bring the echoes with you. By the end of the week, it was impossible to pretend I hadn't heard. The men still nodded, still took their coffee with a quiet thank you. But something in their eyes had changed. Not unkind, but cautious, distant. Even Mrs. Green had grown quieter, though she said nothing outright. Elias noticed. He always did. One afternoon, he came in while I was kneading bread, his hands still dusty from the stables. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I didn't look up. "People talk." He leaned against the counter, studying me with that unreadable calm of his. "People always talk." "Maybe," I said, my hands deep in the dough. "But they don't always mean what they say. And sometimes they do." For a moment, there was only the sound of flour hitting the table. Then he said softly, "You didn't come here to please them." I met his gaze. "No, but I didn't come to be their story either." He didn't answer right away, just watched me, his eyes steady and quiet. "Let it blow over, Clara. Wind doesn't last forever." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But wind can strip a soul bare long before it dies down. That night, I went into town for flour and salt. The general store was busy, women talking, laughter sharp as glass. When I stepped inside, Their voices dropped, but their eyes didn't. One of them, a thin woman with a lace collar, smiled in that way polite people do when they want to hurt you nicely. "So," she said, "how's life out at the Stoneheart place? Heard the rancher keeps you busy." I felt my face flush hot, but my voice stayed calm. "Work's honest. Can't say that about gossip." Her smile cracked, and for a moment, silence fell like dust. Then I turned and paid for my things, my hands trembling only after I left the store. Outside, the air smelled of dry sage and smoke. The wind picked up, tugging at my skirt. I stood there for a while, letting it sting my face, letting it take what it wanted. By the time I got back to the ranch, the sun was gone. Elias was waiting on the porch. He didn't ask where I'd been, just watched me climb the steps, the paper sack of supplies held tight against my chest. "You look tired," he said. "I am." He nodded slowly. "Town talk?" "Yes." Silence. Then, "It'll fade." I laughed softly, without humor. "Will it? Or will it just wait until it finds a new place to land?" He shifted his hat, looking out toward the dark horizon. "You can't stop wind, Clara, but you can decide what it takes with it." Something broke in me then, not the fragile kind of breaking that leaves you smaller, but the kind that finally lets you breathe. "I'm not leaving," I said. He looked at me then, really looked, like a man seeing not a cook or a roomer, but a person who'd survived too much to bend again. "I never thought you would," he said quietly. And with those words, the world seemed to steady again. Later that night, I sat by the stove, watching the flames dance low and tired. The ranch was silent except for the creak of wood and the steady breath of the wind outside. I thought about what he said about choosing what the wind takes. Maybe I couldn't stop people from talking. Maybe I didn't need to, because for the first time, their words didn't define me. They passed through me like smoke, stung for a moment, then vanished into the open sky. I was still here, still cooking, still mending, still standing. And somewhere in the quiet of that fire, I realized strength wasn't about silence or survival. It was about staying. Dawn came soft and slow, the kind that makes the world look almost new. Mist hung low over the valley, and the air smelled of sage and wet earth. The storm had passed days ago, but its echo lingered, in the bent grass, the broken fences, and somewhere deep inside me. I stood by the kitchen window, watching the first rays of sunlight spill across the fields. The world felt different now, lighter, maybe, or maybe I was. The whispers had gone quiet. The men spoke to me like they always had, and Mrs. Green hummed again while she worked. But the silence that followed wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the silence of judgment. It was peace. When Elias came in that morning, I was already cooking, biscuits in the oven, coffee brewing slow and strong. He stepped through the doorway, boots heavy with dew, hat shadowing his eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The light behind him caught the dust in the air, turning it to gold. "Smells good," he said finally. "Biscuits," I replied. "Your favorite." He nodded, removing his gloves, placing them carefully on the table. "You've been up long." I couldn't sleep. He studied me for a moment, then took a step closer. "You think too much when you can't." I smiled faintly. "Bad habit." He didn't smile back. Not quite. But there was something gentler in his eyes than I'd ever seen before. After breakfast, we went outside to check the fences. The valley stretched endless and green, washed clean by the rain. We worked side by side, silent but comfortable, the way people do when words aren't needed. At one point, I stopped to tie my hair back, and when I looked up, he was watching me. Not in the way men sometimes do, not with hunger or pity, but with something quieter, deeper. "What is it?" I asked softly. He hesitated. "You're not what I expected." I laughed. "No one ever is." He smiled then, a small, real thing that changed his whole face. "No," he said, "you're more." The words hit me like sunlight after shadow, warm, impossible, and real. For a long moment I couldn't speak, so I just nodded and went back to work, my heart unsteady but sure. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of copper. The cattle grazed lazily near the stream, and the air was filled with the hum of summer flies. Elias leaned against the fence, quiet as always. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. I shook my head. "Not anymore." He looked at me for a long time, then said, "Good. Be a waste if you did." I smiled, brushing dirt from my hands. "You mean the ranch would fall apart without me?" "Maybe," he said. Then after a pause, "I would." My breath caught. He didn't move, didn't look away. The space between us felt different. Charged, heavy, but not frightening. I didn't know what to say. Maybe there was nothing to say. So I just stepped closer. Close enough that I could hear his breathing, smell the dust and the faint scent of smoke on his coat. The world seemed to hold still. He reached out, hesitated, then touched my hand. Rough palm against flower-soft skin. And in that simple touch, everything we hadn't said finally found its place. That night, after the day's work was done, I sat on the porch watching the last light fade. The air was cool, the sky a deep violet blue. Somewhere out in the dark, the cattle lowed softly. Elias came out, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one and sat beside me, boots resting on the rail. For a while, we just sat there. 2 people who'd weathered different storms and somehow found the same quiet. He didn't reach for me again, and I didn't need him to. The space between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something steady, something earned. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "You found your place here, Clara." I looked out at the valley, the land, the fences, the faint glow of the lantern in the barn. "No," I said softly. "It found me." He turned to me then, his eyes reflecting the fading light. Maybe it was waiting. The crickets started their song, slow and steady. The night settled around us like a promise. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was starting over. I just felt home.